My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to 106.7, Wilmington's Big Talker. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Sunday at 5 p.m., as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. Now, in case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of people from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. For the bulk of our show today, we're going to talk about gun laws. A few weeks ago, I did a seminar for the Heritage Life Skills event in Waynesville, which I titled Getting Ready, Not Arrested, Gun Laws for Preppers. I started out the class by saying, welcome to the Sunday morning meeting of Felons Anonymous. My name is Paul Vallone, and I am a felon. Now, the reason I started it that way is because if you own guns, and especially if you have the temerity to actually carry one, you are undoubtedly a felon. With more than 30,000 gun laws on the books, you violate at least some of them quite regularly. And in segment 2 of the show, we're going to talk about how you can avoid being a lawbreaker. But first, let's talk a little bit about the North Carolina legislature. This is the second year of the 2-year session, generally called the short session. This is supposed to be the short and, if you will, the slow year. They want to go out and campaign in the fall because it's an election year, so they set up the rules to restrict the types of legislation that can be offered and introduced in the short session. And so, unfortunately, it's been anything but slow when it comes to gun-related legislation. In fact, no fewer than, I believe it's now 6 bills have been introduced, 4 of them anti-gun, 2 of them pro-gun pieces of legislation. And apparently, our new rock star for gun control is former Judge Marcia Morey of Durham, who was recently appointed to take over a vacant seat. She is actually at the top as one of the primary sponsors on all 4 of the gun control bills which have been introduced in the General Assembly. Perhaps her greatest threat is House Bill 976. 976 is one of the boilerplate bills for so-called extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws. Now, last week we had Legislative Counsel Mike Hammond of Gun Owners of America on to tell us the general hazards for such extreme risk protection orders. In fact, he refers to them quite correctly as gun confiscation orders. And certainly, Morey's bill, House Bill 976, is no exception. In fact, let's take a look at what that bill would do. Let's say, for example, a vengeful ex or a stepchild or a roommate or even somebody you dated once or maybe even declined to date, since that's not very well defined, they decide to get you by filing a complaint alleging that because you own guns, you are imminently dangerous. You get no time to respond. That complaint, however flimsy or false, produces an immediate ex parte or emergency hearing as in 24/7, 365, whether the court is in session or not. You don't get a chance to defend yourself. The hearing will be held without even giving you notice that you've been accused. Even if you find out and decide that you can hire a lawyer and pay them big bucks to defend you for this hearing to be held the same day, if you choose to defend yourself, you could end up getting your guns confiscated for a year or more. Your guns get seized if the judge decides that there's enough evidence for a temporary order, and they almost always do. You get 24 hours to surrender your guns, after which the sheriff will take them by force, if necessary, at gunpoint. You will lose your right to keep and bear arms. Although the ex parte order is valid for only 10 days, renewable of course, the next hearing will likely result in a full extreme risk protection order valid for renewable periods up to 1 year. By the way, this gets you entered into the National Instant Background Check System, the electronic background check system, as a prohibited person. Good luck getting yourself out of that system, even if the protection order is lifted. You get to pay tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Ex parte hearings, court proceedings, motions, counter motions, all incurring legal fees at probably $300 an hour or more. It's entirely possible you might have to mortgage your house to fight for your guns. Oh, by the way, did I mention your accuser can lie? Although the penalty for perjury is normally 10 to 20 months in prison, HB 976 guarantees that your accuser cannot spend even 1 day in jail for lying to confiscate your guns. The only penalty it allows is for 1 to 30 days of community service, and that's in the unlikely event they get caught at all. You could pay tens of thousands of dollars for storage. No maximum storage fees are stipulated in the bill, so the sheriff who confiscates your guns can charge you whatever he wants for storage. He can also fire them to obtain and record ballistics data, effectively registering your guns. Oh, and we all know that anti-gun sheriffs have a habit of returning confiscated guns in, shall we say, less than ideal conditions. Your guns could be destroyed. So congrats, you spent $50,000 fighting seemingly endless court orders and motions, but you're victorious. The gun confiscation order is finally lifted. Just one little problem remains. You are now broke. The sheriff wants $10,000 for storage in order to return your guns. And oh yes, did we mention that if you don't raise that money to file yet another motion to get them back within 90 days, your guns can be destroyed. That is what they call due process of law. After all, you got your day in court, didn't you? Fortunately, anti-gun bills aren't the only bills being introduced this year. In fact, GRNC was central to drafting House Bill 1039, sponsored by Representatives Larry Pittman, Michael Speciale, Mark Brody, and John Blust. HB 1039 would enable certain school faculty members to carry firearms to protect students. The requirements, fortunately, are fairly simple. They have to have a concealed handgun permit and take 16 hours additional training in active shooter scenarios. But this makes the bill much simpler than a similar Senate bill, which was also recently introduced, but appears to be designed to do absolutely nothing, since teachers would have to get a basic law enforcement technical certification, which takes 2 years, lots of time, effort, and money, and so no one would actually avail themselves of it. So, bottom line is, what we need to make this bill happen. We're going to have a press conference. We're hoping to on this Tuesday, June 5th at 11 o'clock at the General Assembly on Jones Street in Raleigh. Now, if you can make it, we need people to attend. If you're a teacher, we especially need you to attend. And so for more information, email me at directorofdevelopment@grnc.org. That is Director of Development, all one word, at grnc.org. Director of Development at grnc.org. Right now, we're going to take a break. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. Join us after the break as we discuss how you can avoid being an accidental felon. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com, sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. So, a few weeks ago, I taught a course for the Heritage Life Skills event in Waynesville, which was called Getting Ready, Not Arrested, Gun Laws for Preppers. I started out the class by saying, "Welcome to the Sunday morning meeting of Felons Anonymous. My name is Paul, and I'm a felon." Now, the reason I said that is that those of you who have concealed handgun permits, own firearms, or if you have the temerity to actually carry them for self-protection, to you I say congratulations, you're all felons. How many of you have carried firearms for self-protection in North Carolina prior to December of 2013? Well, I would say you are repeat offenders, so bad that your picture should probably be on the wall of a post office someplace. In fact, given the interpretation of gun laws I hear every day, I'm surprised we aren't all in some nice FEMA camp. Now, to those who say, it doesn't make a difference, I'm going to do it anyway, I say, go back and read Orwell's 1984. The fact is, the government can't control the law-abiding. The government has control only over lawbreakers. That way they can decide whether or not you are sufficiently compliant, so they can determine, use prosecutorial discretion to decide whether or not to prosecute you for a crime. Is that really the position you want to be in? Now, the bad news today is that I am not a lawyer, and nothing I am about to say today constitutes legal advice. In particular, I don't want to get any emails from you telling me what laws you may have broken, because I can assure you that no attorney-client privilege applies today. The good news is that when it comes to writing and passing laws to straighten out the mess that is our system of gun laws, I'm your guy. Now, basically, there are two ways to divide gun laws. The first is state versus federal law. Now, today's presentation will deal primarily with federal gun laws. In a future segment, we will deal with the peculiarities of North Carolina gun laws. The second division involves what you are actually doing with the gun, which I will break into the purchase, storage, carry, and use of firearms. To give you an idea of the labyrinth of firearms laws today that conspire to make you a criminal, for the class, I actually drew a map of all of the educational properties in uptown Charlotte, all the schools, and around them I drew a little 1,000-foot radius. That's radius, not diameter. Those are gun-free school zones, which were created by the Gun-Free School Zones Act, first of, I guess it was, I'll have to check on it, but it was reinstituted in 1996. So anyways, the Gun-Free School Zones Act prohibits the ownership of firearms within 1,000 feet of any school with certain limited exceptions. That means if you're driving around uptown Charlotte, you will notice that a number of major arteries fall within those no-gun zones. And note, too, that this is only secondary schools that I drew in. It does not include upper-level institutions. So basically, what that means is that if you drive around uptown Charlotte with a gun in your car, you're a felon. Now, or you could check out General Statute 14269.3, and I should note that our organization has changed that statute to eliminate restrictions on guns in assemblies of people for which admission is charged, or restaurants with on-premises alcohol consumption permits. And since before that, in 2013, you were almost certainly a felon. Now, the place I actually taught the class was in the Folkmoot Center in Waynesville. Part of the Folkmoot Center is educational property. Guns are prohibited there. Now, I don't want to belabor this, but we could spend hours talking about the number of gun-free zones that you have probably violated. Let's first give you a general overview of, I guess, federal gun laws and how they are structured. The first gun control act of significance was the National Firearms Act of 1934. Now, it wasn't gun control per se, because at that point Congress still understood that it did not have the authority under Article 1, Section 8 to actually ban firearms. They've long since forgotten that and usurped or stolen that power. But in 1934, they still understood it. So what they did instead of banning firearms was to tax them, because they do have the power to tax. They taxed, specifically, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, machine guns, sound suppressors, and destructive devices. Now, they put a $200 tax stamp on it, which is a princely sum at that point in time. But the bottom line is that it was just a tax stamp. Unfortunately, as you will see momentarily, although it is quite legal to own machine guns, the Hughes Amendment to the McClure-Volkmer Act, or the Firearms Owners Protection Act of 1986, essentially made it all but impossible to own those machine guns. We'll talk about that shortly. Then we had the Gun Control Act of 1968. That was passed in the wake of political assassinations in the 1960s, since, of course, as Rahm Emanuel has said, never let a good crisis go to waste. For the first time, these systematically regulated interstate commerce in firearms, including importation of guns into the United States. It created a list of prohibited persons who could not own guns. It created a federal firearms licensing system of dealers, which exempted some private transfers, admittedly. It banned the direct shipment of firearms between non-dealers, and perhaps worst of all, it created the sporting purposes definition, which continues to dog us today, as though the Second Amendment had anything to do with hunting. Sporting purposes have nothing to do with your right to keep and bear arms. Then we had the Firearms Owners Protection Act of 1986, also called the McClure-Volkmer Act, which was a piece of pro-gun legislation that actually cured some of the problems of the Gun Control Act of 68. Specifically, it dealt with widespread abuses by the ATF, and it permitted a means for interstate carriage of firearms without violating state laws. Specifically, at least in theory, and I say in theory, you may drive from state to state with firearms in your car, provided they are in a locked compartment separate from ammunition. The bottom line here, however, is that there are certain places, even if you are complying with the law, that you don't want to get pulled over, specifically New Jersey, New York, Maryland, a few other places. New York, in fact, has been arresting people on connecting flights as they attempted to check firearms through the city of New York. Also, as part of that McClure-Volkmer Act, there was a voice vote for the Hughes Amendment, which prohibited the private ownership of any machine gun made after May of 1986, making those that can still be owned by citizens impossibly expensive to own, as collectors snapped them all up. Then we had the Gun-Free School Zones Act, passed in 1990. It prohibited guns on private property within 1,000 feet of any secondary school. Actually, the law was struck down in U.S. versus Lopez by the Supreme Court, but Congress tweaked the language to supposedly comply with the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution, and then passed it again in 1996. Then we had the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993. Now, this law, for the first time, required background checks when buying from licensed dealers. The background check initially required a 5-day waiting period. Now, eventually, that waiting period was replaced by the National Instant Background Check System, the computerized background check system you see today. Now, NICS, I should say, anybody who tells you that NICS can't be used as a gun registration system should know that it already has been. In theory, the FBI is required to expunge transaction records after they've done the background check. In truth, during the Clinton administration, then Attorney General Janet Reno retained the transaction records in violation of the Brady Law in order to turn NICS into a de facto gun registration system. So, once again, anybody who tells you it can't be a gun registration system should know that it already has been. This, by the way, was reversed only by Attorney General John Ashcroft under the Bush administration in 2000. Right now, we're going to take a short break. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. Join us after the break as we discuss how you can avoid becoming an accidental felon. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. We have been talking about gun laws and how you can avoid becoming an accidental felon. In this segment, we're talking about federal gun laws. In a future segment, we will talk about some of the peculiarities of North Carolina state gun laws. And there are some peculiarities, I can assure you. We have been talking in terms of federal laws. We just talked about the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993, which for the first time required background checks, specifically now via the National Instant Background Check System. The good news is, if there can be such a thing said about the 1990s, we dodged some of the really nasty stuff they had in mind for us, specifically Brady II. And when they introduced Brady II, handgun control referred to Brady as the nose of the camel under the tent. And when they introduced Brady II, they said, here's the rest of the camel, which would have included national handgun licensing, restrictions on compact firearms they referred to as Saturday night specials, bans on possessing too much ammunition, too many firearms, arsenal licenses. It was a long, long wish list. Fortunately, the Republican Revolution of 1994 put a stop to that. But not before the Democrats managed to pass the, and I love this Orwellian name, the Public Safety and Recreational Firearms Act of 1994, that you and I know as the so-called assault weapons ban. And I really do hate those words. I'd rather you didn't use them. Assault weapons are essentially non-existent firearms, a category created by the gun control movement in order to create confusion in the public between fully automatic firearms, machine guns, and semi-automatic firearms like the AR-15, which are functionally identical to any hunting firearm. So, with that said, the 1994 semi-auto ban banned a broad range of semi-automatic rifles, handguns, and shotguns. It banned them either by name or by features. Specifically, those features included things like bayonet lugs, pistol grips, folding stocks, flash suppressors, and a variety of other cosmetic features. Now, it also banned the what they referred to as high-capacity magazines of more than 10 rounds. We could call those standard capacity magazines, since the fact is magazines holding more than 10 rounds have been around since the early 20th century. Now, the semi-auto ban, in addition to being ineffective, since the ATF could not point to a single statistic saying that it actually reduced violent crime, but fortunately, the legislators were able to insert into the bill a 10-year sunset. So the bill enacted in 1994 actually was set to sunset in 2004. And I'm happy to say I worked very hard to devalue my own gun collection at that point in time by working to sunset the bill in 2004. And that was not necessarily as easy a thing as it might sound, since unfortunately the NRA was interested in passing the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Firearms Act, thanks in large part, one conjectures, to donations to the NRA Foundation from a certain large gun manufacturer. And this would have prevented the cities from suing gun manufacturers, as was the vogue in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. The problem is they wanted it a little bit too much, and they were ready to hang any amount of gun control onto the bill in order to make sure it passed. Fortunately, we were able to dissuade the NRA, and the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Firearms Act eventually became law without an assault weapon ban, as had earlier been added to the bill. We also have the Lautenberg Amendment, passed in 1997 as part of the Appropriations Act there, which now prohibited firearms for anyone who had been convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. This was the first time a misdemeanor had been included in the prohibited list for owning firearms. Previously, it had been felonies and crimes punishable by more than 1 year in prison. But now, anybody who's been convicted of a variety of older misdemeanors in many cases, or who is subject to a domestic violence restraining order, is on the prohibited list. And in fact, what we are seeing now is a large number of people who are discovering that although they have owned firearms for many years, they go to buy a firearm and suddenly they've been included into NICS as a prohibited person based on some misdemeanor that their lawyer told them to plead guilty to avoid problems, say, 30 years ago. Now, the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Firearms Act, we discussed that. That did eventually become law eventually. Then we had the NICS Improvement Act of 2007. This was passed after the Virginia Tech shootings, ostensibly because shooter Sung Wei Cho was a prohibited person, but Virginia had failed to report him to the National Instant Check System. Specifically, the judge determined that this individual was a danger to himself or others, but rather than detaining him, he sent him home. Danger to self or others? What could possibly go wrong if you send him home? So, anyways, the NICS Improvement Act of 2007 required states to report disqualifying mental health adjudications and involuntary commitments to the FBI for inclusion in NICS. In practice, this was used by the Obama administration to deny gun rights to 260,381 veterans who had post-traumatic stress disorder and who designated representative payees, or basically people to handle their finances. What's more, Obama attempted to do the same thing with the Social Security Administration, potentially denying gun rights to millions of Social Security recipients. But unfortunately for Obama, that executive order was reversed by Donald Trump when he took office. Although we could have had, as I say, millions of people denied who simply took Social Security benefits and designated representative payees. Fortunately, that has no longer been the case since Donald Trump reversed that executive order. That said, however, we may ultimately end up living with exactly that prohibition because Congress was kind enough earlier this year to pass the Fix-Nixed Act of 2018, which requires federal agencies to report to NICS any prohibited persons under 18 U.S. Code Section 922. Now, basically, it establishes penalties for noncompliance by federal agencies. And although this really doesn't sound like much, what it really is designed to do is to have federal agencies report prohibited persons like the Veterans Administration did, like the Social Security Administration did. Okay, unfortunately now it's not a function of executive order, which can be relatively easily reversed, but no, now it's a matter of law, which was passed by Congress. The net result ultimately will be that we will see a large number of people who are denied firearms rights. It's a matter of time before we see which federal agencies report these people as prohibited persons under NICS. There are some ways that we can get out of violating federal gun laws. And I think we'll see when we get to the segment on state laws, there are a lot of, I guess, gotchas that you can avoid. But first and foremost, I recommend you get a concealed handgun permit. This will exempt you from the Gun-Free School Zones Act, for starters, provided you have a concealed handgun permit issued by the state in which the school resides. You may drive through those gun-free zones in a 1,000-foot radius around secondary schools, okay, without being a felon. Another way you can avoid being an accidental felon is to not buy guns for other people. This they refer to as a straw purchase, even if the other person is a legal buyer of a firearm. Okay, and this has been determined by the United States Supreme Court that it's a straw purchase even though the other person may be a legal buyer. If you are in interstate commerce and traveling from state to state, if you're traveling interstate, don't stop. All right, continue on your travels, and you'll, generally speaking, be a lawful individual. We're going to take a break right now. We'll get back to this in just a moment. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom. We'll be back in a moment on how you can avoid being an accidental felon under federal gun laws. My name is Paul Vallona, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com, sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. Now, I've talked in our first segment about some of the bills, gun-related bills, introduced in the North Carolina General Assembly just this year, even though it's the short session when legislative activity is usually minimal so that the politicians can go back out and campaign in the election year. That said, however, we have now had 4 gun control bills and 2 pro-gun bills introduced. Now, what we see here, like the rest of the country, is the competition by two very different ideologies, one of which wants to make sure that we protect schools and ourselves by essentially empowering citizens to protect their families. On the other side, we have the statists who are most interested in having government protect us, who are, quite frankly, happy, and I do believe that. They are, in their heart of hearts, they're happy that this sort of mayhem goes on in the United States because it affords them a greater opportunity to control you, frankly, to seize control by making you dependent on the government to protect you. And that is why they propose gun control to increase that governmental control of you, because you'll no longer be able to protect yourself if they can ban as many firearms as possible. Now, here we've seen Marcia Maury and her cohorts introduce, as I've said, a number of bills for gun confiscation orders. Now, these bills sound very reasonable in their intent. After all, we don't want crazy people having guns, do we? We want to make sure that somebody like a Nicholas Cruz, who is readily identified as a threat to society, we want to make sure that we deprive them of firearms, right? Well, ignoring for a moment all of the problems with the specifics of these gun confiscation orders that I mentioned at the very beginning, namely that they lack due process of law, that you will have your guns confiscated and go through a nightmare, and only after the fact will you get any kind of due process, which may cost you tens of thousands of dollars, which you may not be able to afford to do. We could go on with that nightmare forever. But barring any of that, imagine that, or consider that these people, the left, are so interested in preserving your safety that they are willing to take a dangerous person, relieve them of a firearm or two, not necessarily all of them, and then set them back out into the general population again. They're still dangerous. They may still have guns. They may still have access to guns, as happened in Nashville. The shooter in Nashville recently had his Illinois firearms owner card revoked and surrendered all of his guns, and yet still found guns and shot up a restaurant. So the bottom line is that if they were really concerned about reducing violence, they would remove the violent offender from the population rather than merely relieving them of guns. But of course, this isn't about enhancing your safety. This is about making sure that you can't own firearms and making you more dependent on the government. So as we see this competition of ideologies play out in the North Carolina General Assembly, as it is playing out through the rest of the country, I want you to keep something in mind. No, I don't think Marcia Maury's many gun control proposals will pass in a Republican-led legislature. And by the way, I failed to mention one of those. I believe it's House Bill 1060, actually tries to enact a California-style list of acceptable guns, basically saying that if they don't have the safety standards of California, this is what California has in statutes, that these guns are unsafe and somehow flawed, and therefore they should be banned, including, by the way, banning the ones that are currently in people's possession. I mean, this is really wacky stuff that would probably ban most of the guns in possession in North Carolina today. But, I mean, the fact is, it's not going to pass this year. I know that. However, what I want you to keep in mind is that this is their vision for the future. If we do not maintain conservative control of the legislature in North Carolina, I can assure you that at the very least, that gun confiscation order, the extreme risk protection order she has drafted into House Bill 976, will arrive at the governor's desk. And I can assure you that if the governor is still Roy Cooper, as it will be after the 2018 elections, he's not up for election this time around, if Roy Cooper gets that bill, he will sign it. He would sign the California gun safety bill. The bottom line is that these people, nothing about their intentions, their stated intentions, are honest. What they want is to incrementally end the private ownership of firearms. The more we realize that, the better off we will be, the better equipped we will be to counter their efforts. So the bottom line is that the 2018 elections are once again for all the marbles. To begin to, create energy and momentum for these, I'm asking you to show up for our press conference for the arming faculty, school faculty bill, House Bill 1039, on Tuesday, June 5th. We're asking you, the press conference is at 11 o'clock, asking you to show up about 10:30 at the Legislative Building on Jones Street, specifically right next to the printed bills office on the left as you go into the building. Okay? So Tuesday, June 5th, 10:30 a.m., the printed bills office at the General Assembly on Jones Street. Please join us. Now, if you can do this, we'd like to know how many people will be there. So please send me an email at directorofdevelopment@grnc.org. Director of Development, that's all one word, directorofdevelopment@grnc.org. And that will get us started, and we can demonstrate to the media and to the people of North Carolina that our side of this competing ideology, namely to institute laws that allow citizens to better protect themselves, rather than having to rely on a government which will invariably fail them, as it did in Parkland and has done elsewhere. The government will fail you. The only people that can protect you, the only people that can protect the students, are, frankly, us. In schools, it will be the faculty members, it will be the teachers, it will be the last layer of defense. At home, it's you protecting your family. Because, as we all have heard from the cliche, when seconds count, help is only minutes away. So you know you have to be able to protect yourself. You know that is the only solution. And you know that the left is being utterly dishonest in proposing any other potential solution. So we would like you to help us make this next election happen by going to grnc.org and contributing to the GRNC Political Victory Fund. The GRNC Political Victory Fund is what we use to throw the bums out, to elect pro-gun candidates and defeat anti-gun candidates, because we are restricted by law from using organizational money to impact elections. So grnc.org and go to the GRNC Political Victory Fund. Meanwhile, my name is Paul Vallone. You have been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com, where each Sunday at 5 p.m. as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. Please check out my website at gunspoliticsandfreedom.com. You may also find back episodes of this show on that website or on YouTube, gunspoliticsandfreedom.com. See you next week.